Good evening, everyone. Good evening, welcome. There are few spaces that are preeminent for evenings spent in community and contemplation, and the Rode Hoed is one of them. I am Ian Kenny, Executive Director of the John Adams Institute, and together with our longtime partners here at the Rode Hoed, we have spent years filling this room together with conversations worth having. And tonight, I'm confident that we've managed to do it again. A warm welcome to you all, and in particular to our friends at CLVN. We are especially glad to welcome Michael Pollan back to Amsterdam. We owe a warm thank you to his Dutch publisher, the Arbeiderspers, for translating his many works into Dutch and for helping make it possible for Michael to return to our community. With his fourth visit, he stands among the most beloved speakers in John Adams Institute history. There are a small number of guests who become, over the years, something like companions of this institute. Thinkers that we invite time and again, not because they bring certainty, but because they reliably take us somewhere that we did not expect to go. And Michael Pollan is chief among them. A beloved journalist and one of the most compelling minds writing today. He has made a career of turning problems on their head, of approaching the familiar from an unfamiliar angle, and getting not necessarily to final conclusions, but to what I would call the thorny and often wild heart of things. Tonight he will discuss what I would argue is his most intimate and consequential subject that he's yet taken on. In his new book, A World Appears, it is an inquiry into consciousness itself, what it is, how it arises, and what it means to be aware. Pollan has long turned his attention to matters of the body and of the mind, and tonight I think we are entering something that we might call the territory of the soul, or at least that is one way that we could approach a phenomenon so vast and so close that it moves, almost paradoxically, from being intimately knowable to something utterly innate. We live inside consciousness. We cannot step outside to examine it. But through neuroscience, philosophy, literature, the natural world, and yes, psychedelics, Michael Pollan has managed to map its terrain with his trademark blend of curiosity and clarity. And he'll introduce us tonight to plant neurobiologists searching for signs of awareness in greenery, to psychologists who are tracing the contours of subjective experience, and to artificial intelligence researchers asking whether feeling might be something that machines could one day approach. The book draws on multiple schools of thought, and rather than resolving their tensions, Pollan holds them open. That generosity towards complexity is, I think, part of what makes him such a necessary voice right now, and why so many of you came out to see him tonight here in Amsterdam. Because the stakes are not only philosophical. We live in a moment that seems in many ways allergic to the inner life, to slowness, to nuance, to the kind of patient attention that genuine understanding requires. Our politics have grown louder and less curious. Our public discourse rewards certainty over inquiry, and the gap between how we experience ourselves privately and how we engage with one another publicly has perhaps never felt wider. And yet, and this is where Pollan's work becomes something more than a book about the mind, consciousness connects us all. What we understand about awareness, attention, and perception shapes not only how we know ourselves, but how we see others. It shapes the quality of our listening, the generosity of our interpretation, and the kind of communities that we are capable of building together. To be conscious, fully and generously, is not a private achievement. It is, in the deepest sense, a civic one. In a moment, I will invite Michael Pollan to join us on stage. After a short reading, he will be in conversation with Wouter van Noort, opinion editor at the NRC and host of Future Affairs and Het Mysterie van Bewustzijn, whose gift for connecting the life of ideas to the life that we actually lead makes him a wonderfully fitting companion for this particular journey. And never fear, your questions will very much be a part of the evening. You can submit them via the QR code throughout the event, and my colleague Sean will be gathering them throughout the evening, and Wouter will, of course, make sure that they find their way into the conversation. Now, dear friends, please join me in welcoming Michael Pollan. Take it away.
Thank you. Ian, what a beautiful introduction. You don't know, people usually just read the thing on the book jacket and call it an introduction. That was real writing. I'm impressed. Forgive me, I have a bit of a cold. It's great to be back here. I can't believe I've been in this room 4 times. Each time has been a privilege and a treat, and it's wonderful to be in Amsterdam. I'm going to read from the introduction and help us kind of set things up. I haven't read this passage before aloud, so bear with me. If I run into words I don't know how to pronounce. It's entirely possible to go through life without worrying about the problem of consciousness, what it is and how it came to be. In fact, it takes a certain kind of mind for the problem to arise, one that is self-conscious or aware that it is aware and marvels at this mystery, which is, when you stop to think about it, astounding. It is astounding that in a universe we often assume to be dead and purposeless, there evolved beings who can experience this reality and have feelings and thoughts, not only about the appearing world, but about the fact that they have feelings and thoughts at all. And it is still more astounding that these beings have minds capable of imagining counterfactuals, such as the possibility of a world without consciousness. Except for a brief period in my teenage years when I was reading Hermann Hesse, writing bad poetry, and thinking about the big questions, I never gave much thought to consciousness. What pushed the question front and center for me were a couple of psychedelic experiences I had in my 50s and 60s. These were research trips for my previous book, How to Change Your Mind. In small doses, psychedelics smudge the pain of normal perception in ways that allow us to see that there is indeed something standing between ourselves and reality, inflecting or possibly even constituting it, and that reality might be different than it appears in that unsmudged pain. The experience defamiliarizes everyday consciousness, allowing us to see it freshly, indeed in some cases to see it for the first time. It's a bit like the way art can reveal the deep strangeness of things we normally take for granted. Edmund Husserl, now that I don't know how to pronounce. Husserl? Anyone know? Okay, I guess so. The turn-of-the-century Austrian-German phenomenologist called our unthinking, seemingly transparent experience of everyday reality as something out there and independent of our minds the natural attitude. It's our default, and it represents a kind of naive realism. By contrast, the phenomenological attitude that Husserl urged us to adopt involves taking a step back and investigating everything about our experience. Psychedelics, meditation too, seems to nudge us in precisely that direction, calling attention to the pain of perception and turning ordinary people into practicing phenomenologists. All sorts of questions suddenly jump out at me. What is consciousness for? Most of what our brains do to keep us alive happens automatically, under the hood and outside of our awareness. So why are some of these operations available for reflection? When did this capacity emerge in evolution, and why? And then this, is it within our power to change our everyday default consciousness? Could that be one of its functions, to give us a way to reflect on our automatic behaviors so that we might transcend them and transform ourselves? These are just some of the questions that began to preoccupy me in the weeks and months after my first psychedelic experience. I got into meditation and started paying more attention to the form, not just the contents of my stream of thought. And I turned to reading, starting with science, but eventually following a trail of crumbs that led me to works of philosophy, literature, and religion. And then the idea of writing this book took hold, which in retrospect seems hopelessly naive, possibly even an act of hubris. Who am I to unravel one of the 3 biggest mysteries in the universe? The other 2? Why is there something rather than nothing? And how did life arise from dead matter? My main qualification is that I am a conscious human being who has become intensely curious about that fact. I also happen to be a science writer with a background in the humanities, which turned out to be more valuable than I would have expected. Literature, philosophy, and religion have been thinking longer and harder about consciousness than the sciences have, and I discovered that they have at least as much light to shed on the phenomenon. They can also help us defend the richness and complexity of consciousness from science's tendency to simplify whatever it is trying to explain. I cannot guarantee that by the end of this book you will know more about consciousness than you do now. Like me, you may find that you know less than you do now. I know that's not a selling proposition for a book, but it's honest. You may discover that, as it turns out, things you thought we solidly knew about consciousness, such as the presumption that it is generated by brains or that it gives us a faithful picture of reality, we really don't know at all. What William Goldman, the screenwriter, famously said about Hollywood can be applied to the scientific study of consciousness. Nobody knows anything. I'm exaggerating, but not by a lot. Not knowing can be a source of frustration, but it also can be an opportunity, a spur to deeper exploration, including of one's own mind. My hope is that this book smudges the window pane of your own consciousness and serves as a tool to help you fully appreciate the everyday miracle that a world appears when you open your eyes, a world and so much else, including you, a self. A sturdy scientific explanation of how this happens would be welcome, but I've found that it's possible to hold this most elusive phenomenon in our hands while at the same time letting go of the idea we will ever understand it completely. According to one of the scientists you're about to meet, consciousness is born of uncertainty. In a completely predictable world, we wouldn't need it, and the light of consciousness would probably blink out. Yet although it is uncertainty that awakened us, we find living with it difficult, so we reach for theories that promise an explanation. By one recent count, there are no fewer than 22 of them in the field. You've already heard about a couple of them. You haven't, actually, but anyone who's read the rest of the introduction has. Trust me. And we'll soon encounter several more. But in the course of researching and writing this book, I discovered that we can do something else with consciousness besides just trying to solve the puzzle of it. We can learn how to make better use of it. The trajectory of these explorations, one I never could have predicted when I started out, has taken me from theories of consciousness to something more like practice. This, then, is the wager of A World Appears, that by the end of this journey, you will be more conscious than you were before it. Conscious of what? Of the rhythms and workings of your own mind, of the sentience that is all around us in nature, and of the improbable fact, the miracle, that in this universe of rock and fire and ice and infinite space, we are somehow not only here, but aware. Thank you.
Well, congratulations, Michael. I think you successfully pitched the book about knowing less about a topic when you're done reading with it. But what is it exactly that you know less about now? What is consciousness?
Well, there were things that... Can you hear me? It's on, right? I automatically assumed that consciousness is an emergent property of brains. And I was going to learn how that worked. I came to the general conclusion, though, that emergent is scientific language for abracadabra. That nobody really can explain that.
What is it? Maybe it's good to stand still. What emergent?
Well, emergence is the idea that complex systems give rise to unpredictable or unforeshadowed behaviors of various kinds.
More than the sum of its parts.
Definitely more than the sum of its parts. And obviously that's true of consciousness, but how you get there, you know, I think ice is an emergent property of water. Like, we can get that. We understand how that happens. But we're really not close to understanding that. So that was a big thing that I assumed. And I approached this as a materialist, I mean, philosophically. And I figured that, like other phenomena, consciousness could be ultimately reduced to matter and energy in some kind of arrangement. And, but nobody has yet explained any single conscious experience in terms of matter. So that's
how coffee smells, or the taste of mint. You cannot reduce it to...
These things we call qualia, or philosophers call qualia, that there is a felt quality to our experience of the world, is just really hard to understand. And now, I should say, they haven't been working on it that long. The modern science of consciousness is less than 50 years old. It really starts in the late 1980s, which I found amazing, too. I figured people had been working on this for a long time. And you did have Freud worked on it in a way, and William James worked on it in the 19th century.
Well, and in philosophy and religion, of course.
Oh, without question. No, I mean, the mind-body problem has been around for thousands of years, and philosophers have been working on it. But I'm talking about the sort of rigorous scientific study. And that really begins with Francis Crick, who had won the Nobel Prize, co-won the Nobel Prize for his discovery of the double helix, and solving
of DNA.
And solving the mystery of heredity. How do traits get passed down? Which nobody, was a big mystery then. And he was a pretty arrogant guy, brilliant too, that the same kind of reductive materialist science he could use that to explain consciousness. So that was his next trick. And he allied himself with a young neuroscientist named Christoph Koch, and the two of them proceeded on this quest, and they were looking for what they called the neural correlates of consciousness. Which neurons in the brain were responsible for consciousness?
We'll get to the strange character of Koch in a minute, but still the question of what it is, what your definition of it is, because there are so many definitions abound. Is it experience? Is it felt experience? Is it something else that you...
I think experience is a good one-word definition. Your toaster doesn't have experience.
Probably not. Rocks
don't. Toasters in the future might. It's subjective experience. I like the philosopher Thomas Nagel wrote a famous essay in the 70s, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And he argued that if it's like anything to be a bat, and we don't know what it's like to be a bat, but we can imagine it's like something to navigate the world using echolocation instead of vision. It has some felt quality. So that was sort of his test, and that's been taken up by a lot of the researchers.
So it's quite a broad definition of felt experience, and it's probably has to do something with being alive as well, right?
Yeah, feeling of being alive. Yeah. I think that's it. I mean, there are all these other things that human consciousness is. We have self-consciousness. We have, I talked about we're aware that we're aware. We have meta-consciousness, and that's. But I wouldn't include that in the definition. I think that's kind of, the human, the way humans do consciousness.
Yeah, it's like something to be something.
Yeah.
Basically, that's what you delved into, and that's what you came to know less about, really, in this search. And the interesting thing is that it runs parallel, also your quest, with quite a shift in this eternal question. That's what struck my attention around this question, is that we've been talking about this for centuries, really, and only the past few decades, there's been quite a shift in the scientific outlook on this question, and also challenging many of the basic assumptions of science itself, really. And I think the name you just brought up, Christoph Koch, he had a little journey of himself as well that you really nicely describe in the book. Maybe it's good because he personifies this shift, really, for me.
Yeah, I mean, he's an interesting character. So he's German-American, brilliant guy, was, I think, a postdoc at Caltech when he connected with, I'm sorry, I just dropped the name, Francis Crick. And he was full of, like, we're going to solve this problem. And he's a brain guy. I mean, he ran the Allen Brain Institute in Seattle, and worked with neurons and taking individual neurons or putting in probes. They would get neural tissue from brain surgeons and quickly, try giving it drugs and all this kind of stuff. So he really believed brains were going to be at the center of the story. He's been disillusioned twice, actually. Early in the quest, he and he and Crick have written this landmark paper associating consciousness with a certain frequency of brainwave, I think 30 hertz or something like that. And he goes to a conference and presents this, and it's a really big deal. And this neurologist says, well, why isn't it 20 hertz or 40 hertz? Like, what does that really tell you? And he's up all night thinking, oh, shit.
Good question.
Yeah, good question. The neural correlates, they correlate, but they're not going to give you any kind of causal, and they're not going to help you understand the experience people are having, which is internal.
But he also still laid the groundwork for one of the main theories of consciousness for a long time, linking conscious experience to at least interactions with matter, right?
Yeah, he did do that. He also endorsed another theory called integrated information theory that was arguably a step forward, but some people are very dismissive of that. But what's interesting about him is that he changes his mind. And in my experience, most scientists don't do that. There's this saying that science changes one funeral at a time, because people hold on to their ideas so fiercely. And anyway, the other change you alluded to, though, was Christoph got very interested in psychedelics, and we had many conversations about this. And he was actually giving psilocybin to these individual brain cells at the Allen Institute. Nothing of note happened. I mean, things did happen, but not in a pattern that was interesting.
And then he gave it to his own brain cells.
A lot of scientists are afraid to use psychedelics because, their brain is their way of life. But others find it helpful and interesting. And consciousness scientists, they're all using psychedelics. I was so surprised. Now, there's a kind of a, selection bias that they knew they could talk to me about it. But still, it was interesting how common it was. So anyway, so Christoph goes to Brazil and has 5 nights of ayahuasca on the beach with a shaman. And he experiences what he called mind at large, consciousness outside of his brain.
Yeah, his most recent book title is Then I Am Myself, the World.
Right.
Which is, I think, a wonderful description of
Schopenhauer quote, I think. Yeah.
Being one with the cosmos. Really.
Yeah.
And that's now suddenly also what he believes, right?
I think it is. I don't know how far down this path he's gone, but basically he came out of it sounding, an idealist. I mean, somebody who believes consciousness is outside of us and we channel it. In The Doors of Perception, Aldous Huxley had a very similar model where he said the mind's main function is to edit this flood of consciousness that's available to us. And we have what he called a reducing valve. And normally it allows in only the trickle of consciousness you need to survive. But there's a whole lot more out there. And on psychedelics, the reducing valve opens wider. And
consciousness by itself is more like you're receiving something than it's...
Yeah, it's like you're a radio receiver. Yeah, you're not producing it, you're receiving it. They're called transmission theories, in fact. And
this sounds, coming from standard Western scientific worldview, quite a weird way of looking at consciousness, right?
I would say. But why?
How far out is Koch from his colleagues?
Well, it's interesting. I think there's been some snickering about this. I've picked up from other scientists. I don't know that he feels he's paid any reputational price for doing this. I think the field is generous in that there is a general recognition that the usual ways of doing things aren't panning out. So there's a more serious entertaining of strange ideas. I mean, another one is panpsychism, and this is the idea that consciousness didn't have to come into the world, it didn't evolve, it was always here, and it's a property of the particles in this table. And but then you run into another kind of hard problem.
The toaster is conscious.
The toaster is conscious in that model, exactly. And the problem with this theory, besides the fact it's a kind of an extravagant solution to the problem by just saying consciousness was always here, so we don't have to explain how it arose, is that how did all these little bits, these eensy-weensy, slightly conscious particles, they're not thinking, but they have some psyche. How do they combine to make complicated forms of consciousness like ours. And that's an unsolved problem.
But it is. And what you are laying out is that there are many competing theories now with serious issues, all of them.
And they have different metaphysics underneath them. I mean,
different worldviews, different assumptions about reality, assumptions that might sound even a bit more spiritual than they do scientific sometimes, right?
Oh yeah, no.
And I loved your book because it has a very modest and curious approach to this, and you delve into the sciences that propose these theories. But you do leave open a big question mark for me.
Which is?
What do you think? And I know that you're not going to answer it straight away, but if I pressed you a little bit after a few beers tonight.
Feel free to press me, because I don't know. I left this book with an open mind, and ideas I didn't take seriously, I'm willing to entertain. I'm not willing to embrace them. I don't know how you would prove that panpsychism exists. It's sort of like some of these theories in physics, like you've got a problem with quantum mechanics, quantum theory, and you can solve it by stipulating that there are, an infinite number of different worlds, multiverse theory. It solves your problem, but it
creates a bunch of new ones.
And you're paying an extravagant price for the solution. And I think that's true with these other ideas. So I would still, I was trained as a materialist. I mean, this is the world that we live in. Most of us are in that paradigm. And the significance of consciousness science may be to topple that paradigm, or at least, make it shake. So I think that all these ideas are both plausible and implausible at the same time.
And during your weirdest psychedelic experience, what did you think consciousness was?
I didn't have that experience that it was outside my head. I did have an experience that the plants in my garden were conscious, which is to say that consciousness was widespread. I mean, and this is a very common phenomenon on psychedelics. This has been studied. That you become an animist, basically, on psychedelics.
Everything around you is alive.
Everything, yeah. And for me, the focus was on these plants, but, the world is conscious. And that, I think, is a very interesting idea, because I think it chimes with the fact that we are discovering that more and more species, more than we ever imagined, are conscious or sentient. As in some cases, I think it's a better word. I can define that later. But we have, if you start with Descartes, who basically said humans have a monopoly on consciousness.
I think, therefore I am.
I think, therefore I am. But the only I is a human, and he believed this idea with such tenacity that he could actually dissect dogs and rabbits while they were alive.
The guy owned a dog. And still, he was an automaton.
And that's, the power of a human idea, that you can completely have a dog and think that when it screams in pain as you slice it open, that it is just noise. But anyway, that belief, which I think had a lot to do with shaping how we handle the world, how we treat other species, how we treat nature, which is to say nothing is conscious but us, so we don't owe we have no moral obligations. That's been changing, and we keep learning that animals can do all these things we didn't think they could do. We were the exclusive tool maker, nope. Exclusive language, nope. There's very little left that is exclusive. Just recently, there was an experiment showing that, I think it was chimpanzees have imagination. We thought we had a monopoly on imagination. You can teach a chimp to play that game where, that you would do with a 4-year-old of a fake tea party. There's actually no liquid and you're pouring it into cups and everybody's sipping it. You have to be in on the game. You have to be able to imagine what's going on. And chimps can do that. I think the only thing we'll find animals can't do is worry about consciousness.
Well, not as far as we know, but it clearly shows cracks in worldviews and assumptions that have been set in stone. It also raises the question: how could we have been so blind, really? Because if you look around you,
well, it served us. I think it served us. If you want to eat animals and eat mammals, it serves you not to think they're conscious. So I think it was very instrumental. But it's interesting that, the default for humans is an animist view of the world, right? I mean, that has existed a lot longer than the Enlightenment sense that the world is dead and we can do what we want with it. And children all begin as animists, and then we kind of knock it out of them in school.
I have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old.
So you know, right?
Yeah.
They're animists. So, but the science is kind of reanimating the world in a way that I think is really interesting, and it's one of the most hopeful things going on at a time when there are not a lot of hopeful things going on. The question is whether we'll change our behavior in light of that. Does consciousness entitle beings to moral consideration, which I think it should? And if we start to see that even plants have some sentience, what are the practical implications?
Yeah, we'll delve into that. I can imagine that there are some questions from the audience as well, and Sean, I think, can be of help with that. Right, Sean?
Yeah, I got a couple questions. Been sorting through all your answers or all your questions, and we'll focus on the part about consciousness first. I saw some come in about plant life and AI, but we'll get to those later in the evening. Don't worry about that. But first, I got a question from Liz, talking about age and brain maturity. What is your view on how consciousness develops as the brain matures? How does being conscious support itself within that framework?
Well, one of the things I was really surprised to learn is that we didn't think babies were conscious till like the late 80s. Isn't that amazing? And it was...
Already born babies.
Already born babies, yes. And when you did surgery on infants, it was done without anesthesia.
No way.
Yeah, routinely. Look it up. Yeah, I know. It's crazy. Late 80s. So there is a developmental process that I look at.
But then, how can we be so blind again? How can this paradigm be so dominant?
Get enchanted by ideas, and this is a powerful idea. I don't understand that. I don't understand how the infants put up with it. I really don't. But now it's generally understood that we've granted consciousness even to infants, and it's different than ours. There's no sense of being separate, and of course, they were not separate from their mothers, very recently. And that there is a process of developing a self that takes several years and really doesn't lock in until age 5 or so when you have episodic memory. So you've got a kid on either side of that divide.
Right, yeah.
And before that, kids... they have memory. I mean, they can tell you what they ate yesterday and stuff like that, but they can't knit stories of what happened together to make a coherent self. And it appears that the self is very much the product of memory, of episodic memory. And so until you can have that continuity, that I'm the person this happened to. But before 5, this is Alison Gopnik's research, this is a developmental psychologist I interviewed a couple times. If you take a child of like a 3 or 4-year-old to the zoo, and you ask them what happened, they'll tell you what their mother or father said happened. So if the parent says, and then we saw the animal, the chimp flung its poop at the cage, memorable thing for kids. That'll be the story of going to the. They won't have their own story of going to the zoo. That'll be the story. And then, so after 5, and of course most of us have very few memories before the age of 5, of us before the age of 5. So that's all I know about that.
Does that answer the question, Sean, a little bit?
I hope so.
Yeah.
We had one question about your approach with materialism. If you had to argue against materialism, how would you make that case?
Well, I mean, there's the experiential argument that Christoph had, but another one is there's a Dutch-Brazilian philosopher named Bernardo Kastrup. Some people are nodding their heads. He's a very interesting thinker and writes very clearly about materialism, and he's an idealist. And in fact, Christoph Koch ended up working with him.
He blurbed his book, I saw.
Yes,
yeah.
And he introduced me to Bernardo. So Bernardo's theory, if I can just, I'm going to butcher it a little bit, but he points out that the only thing we know for sure is consciousness. That is the only thing we have direct knowledge of. Everything else we know is through consciousness, is an inference. And that includes matter. So why is it that we give less cred to consciousness that we know directly than we do to this thing that we know only by inference? Matter.
Well, and Bernardo drags in all kinds of quantum
I wasn't going to go
theories. Why don't you want to go there? Is that too?
It's
mystifying?
complicated. Yeah, it's complicated. I mean, you should read him. He's very clear, actually. He's a very good writer and very fierce in argument. But so what does he propose instead is idealism. This idea that there is a vast ocean of consciousness, and we are all alters of it. In other words, if you think of someone with multiple personality disorder, which has a new name, what is the name? Dissociative identity disorder, yeah. So one brain or mind can hold many different personalities in that case, like 20 of them. And we are like that for the universe. We each have our own alter. We are an alter of that. And that's an interesting idea, but like, what do you do with it? Is there a way to prove it?
Well, he would say that it changes everything, but I think it's a good idea not to get dragged into sort of the depth of quantum consciousness theories, because it's basically too complicated for me to understand.
Not knowing is one of the things I learned.
Yeah.
And saying I don't know is another thing I learned. I never used to ever say I don't know.
As a science journalist, mind you.
Yeah, I know.
One final question.
Yeah, maybe this question you'd say I don't know to as well, but people had some questions about your writing journey and kind of reflecting on that. You know, when you reflect on the book, do you experience yourself as a conscious being, or do you feel like you simply appear within consciousness?
Yeah, no, the hero of this book is a conscious human being named Michael Pollan. And I'm conscious the whole time. I think I'm a little more conscious at the end than I was at the beginning.
Well, but the question does have a serious ring to it, because a lot of great artists and writers, they say that their work appears through them. And you can also link that to some altered states of consciousness, maybe. Have you experienced that, or?
Well, I'm not a great writer, so I don't know that applies. I mean, for great artists, I think that's true. Yeah, I don't make those kind of claims for what I do.
Okay, that's modest of you. You already brought the topic of plants up, right?
Yeah.
As Michael Pollan does, I guess, right? What is it with you and plants?
Well, it's my last name, right? I mean,
Pollan.
I was fated. I was fated to write about plants. My first book was about being in the garden, what I learned from the plants in my garden, and I'm very interested in that plants can change our minds. Yes, it's a long-standing interest of mine. And when I had that experience that I described, the psychedelic experience about plants, I kind of approached it, William James, when he wrote Varieties of Mystical Experience, he was dealing with this question, well, what's the truth value of these experiences people are reporting, encounters with the divine or whatever it is? And he said, we don't know we can't say they're false, because we don't know everything about the world. So the test should be, is it useful to think this way? Does it pay off? He's a pragmatist. And the second question is, treat these events as hypotheses and see whether you put it out as a hypothesis, and then you see if you can find any support for it. And look at it through other ways of knowing. So I decided to do that with plants. I wanted to start with a very basic form of consciousness, which in the book I define as sentience.
Yeah, well, we have to
define
that
yeah.
too, right?
It's not hard. I mean, sentience is the most basic form of consciousness. It implies awareness of your environment and an ability to distinguish good or bad changes in that environment.
Dangers and
or
reward.
toxic versus food. Some really basic valenced things, and then the ability to respond intelligently. That may well be a property of life, of all living things. It may be that you need that to survive in a world that is unpredictable, and that the whole idea that you could program everything in your DNA or in a creature's DNA to deal with every contingency isn't realistic.
The world is too unpredictable.
Exactly,
and changing.
exactly. So what evolution produces are cognitive beings that can solve problems and respond to things unimagined by their DNA.
Yeah.
And
that's something different than consciousness. That's sentience?
Yeah.
And what makes it different?
Consciousness is the way we do sentience. Every animal, I would say, every species does it in a different way, depending on its body type, sensorium, needs, niche. So we have a very particular way of doing it, and involving things like self-consciousness and this other, these meta layers that we need given who we are and how our way of life. Plants don't need that. What they really need, the most important thing to them is like biochemistry, right? They need to be able to produce really interesting molecules that because they can't run away, so they have to defend themselves.
They have to eat light and grow. And so framing it this way, sentience is quite uncontroversial for plants, I would say, right?
Well, no. You can find people who don't believe that. The biologists,
even sentience, because I can imagine consciousness being a bit more controversial in plants. But
no, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that a traditional botanist would buy that. So the scientists I looked at are called They call themselves plant neurobiologists, even though they know that there are no neurons in plants. They're just trolling these more conventional botanists, and it drives them crazy. And they're doing these really interesting experiments on plants. I'll just give you a couple. I posted some videos of these experiments on my website. You might check it out. One shows a corn plant navigating a maze. In other words, I know. Navigating might be a strong word. But you put a little ammonium nitrate, which is nitrogen source for corn. They love it. And you put that somewhere in the maze, and the root will find the most direct path to the fertilizer. And that's pretty cool. There's another video of a bean plant next to a pole. And the bean plant is doing what Darwin called circumnutation. Darwin spent a lot of time in his bedroom watching bean plants in the years before time-lapse. It must have been really exciting. But anyway, they did this pattern, and I've seen this in my garden, and I just thought by accident they hit something, and then they start growing up. But they know they're aiming at something. This bean plant can see.
That's already assuming something, Michael.
I know. Well, what's a better word? I mean, the plant is aiming at, sees where this pole is.
Sense could be?
Sense is good. That's very good. Yeah. It senses where the pole is. We don't know how. It may be echolocation, because every time the plant cell divides, it makes a little noise, and maybe they reflect that off of the pole. But it's casting like a fly fisherman, and over again, and straining. And now I'm starting to anthropomorphize. And then finally it catches the thing, and then the leaves relax. It's very poignant.
Yeah, but I've also seen clips of plants moving towards the light and
we know they have phototropism, and that's easier to explain.
And learning and having memories.
Yes, so you can train a plant, you can condition it. They do this with Mimosa pudica, which is the sensitive plant. It's you touch it and the leaves
Kruidje roer me
collapse.
niet in Dutch.
What?
Kruidje roer me niet.
Ah, thank you. And you can teach it to ignore a stimulus, and it will remember it needn't respond to that stimulus for a month. Fruit flies only remember stuff for 24 hours. So that's impressive. But the one I found most interesting and provocative is the fact that the same anesthetics that we can use in surgery to put us out do the same for plants. Now, you might think plants are already out, but they're not. They're just slow. And
that is mind-blowing. And are the same anesthetics
the
work?
Same chemicals. And we don't understand how they work on us,
and they
by the
put
way.
plants to sleep and...
So you take a plant with a visible behavior like Mimosa pudica or a Venus flytrap, and you put it in a bell jar and you put this gas in there. Xenon gas is one they use. But it works with all the human anesthetics, and it won't respond. It will not close on an insect, and then a few hours later it'll wake up again. So what has the plant lost when it's under anesthesia?
What is it like to be a plant?
What is it like to be a plant? Yeah. So
is it something to...
I don't know. There's one I'm not prepared to say it's like something to be a plant, but we're sure getting close to that. So anyway, I came out of this thinking with a lot more respect for plants and open to this idea that sentience is a property of life. And that changes how you look at things. I mean, that reanimates a lot of the world.
Can we delve into the question, what is it like to be a plant, a little bit more?
Yeah, sure.
Maybe get into its roots, and what is it like to be a beanstalk, trying to find something? And do they have senses?
I think the key thing is the existential fact of plant life is what I alluded to. They can't get up and run away. That dictates everything. The sessile lifestyle, as it's called. I mean, I think that's
like we're having now. Right?
Yes, exactly. We're not rooted, though, in quite the same way. We can get up, we can, if there's a fire or something, we can get out of here. Plants could not. So as I say, they have to rely on chemistry the way we rely on locomotion.
How would their perception of time be?
Well, there's a funny story that a science fiction tale that one of the plant neurobiologists told me. He told me at one point, by the way, if you're worrying about eating plants, I can put you at ease.
This is the guy who says, eat food, not too much, mostly plants.
I know, right? I know. No, I worried that, wait, do they feel pain? Yeah, I know. It's concerning. I talked to two plant neurobiologists of it. One of them, this gruff Bulgarian guy, said, oh, yeah, of course they feel pain, but we have to eat them anyway. He was a realist. And then there was this, then I talked to Stefano Mancuso, this Italian plant neurobiologist. He said, no, it wouldn't be adaptive to feel pain if you can't move. So if you can't...
That's what they said about babies.
Yeah. Yes, I should tell him that. So but he felt that it wouldn't be adaptive. He said they know they're being eaten. They're aware of it, but he doesn't think they feel pain. So who knows? But it is worth remembering that many plants evolved to be eaten by mammals, right? I mean, grasses are regenerated by ruminants chomping on them, and then there's all the fruit and the seeds and nuts that they produce. So they're down with us eating them.
And I think I'm with the Bulgarian guy that we have to eat something, right?
If we don't eat plants, we're left with salt, period. That's it.
The question that lingers, though, is because there seems to be a shifting definition in this discussion as well about sentience, intelligence, sensing, feeling. The whole question of consciousness is something that you also describe in your own book as maybe a science-y term for the term soul, right? What is it not too vague of a concept to be really treating scientifically, or do we need to open it up a little bit more?
Well, it is elusive, and the reason is there's so many different kinds of consciousness. I mean, we've talked about several of them. and that's why experience is a good base, and sentience is another base, kind of lower down. But then you have the kind of consciousness we have. And so, yeah, I think the soul lurks under the whole conversation of consciousness, I think, in a way that's maybe wishful, because souls are indestructible. And I think there is a wish that consciousness be that too. And, you know, the fact that it's immaterial makes us think that maybe it can transcend the mortal body. And we don't know. It may just end when we end. But obviously there's a long history in a great many religions and a great many cultures that consciousness does transcend, or the spirit, as it's called. So I think that there is some, I mean, you could call it wish fulfillment in the conversation about consciousness.
And if I press you on this one personally again, after this quest, because this is the basic question, also underpinning the question of consciousness, is what is life and what happens after it, and what can we experience after it, maybe.
Yeah.
Did this quest change your views on death?
No. I didn't come around to this idea that consciousness survives our death. I mean, it might. I mean, in the Castrup world, you know, our individual consciousness melds into the general, you know, goes back into the...
Although he's quite bleak at what that means, because after
well,
this
there's no
life
identity.
You can become an ant in the garden, and they don't really have pleasant lives, so...
Right. No, I mean, it's, you know, I mean, but that's true with Buddhism too, which has a version of reincarnation as other things, some of which you wouldn't want to be. No, it didn't really change my sense that death has a finality to it. Sorry. But you see, there is that, we have that urge, we have that wish, and I think that's part of our interest in consciousness.
Also because the questions that these new insights on consciousness raise revolve around exactly these questions, right? The existential questions, what it means to die.
For philosophers, I don't think scientists are thinking that way about it. I mean, they're really looking for mechanism. I don't think they're...
Maybe that's a problem or not.
Maybe it is a problem, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, are the philosophers... I don't even think the philosophers are. I mean, I think that... I think there's a taboo in talking about that in science. Maybe they think about it. But in general, the scientists I interviewed, I would say, are mostly atheists. So, anyway.
Maybe some questions from the audience. I can imagine that these live questions solicit some response.
Yeah, it was definitely some question about plants. Let's start there. We couple about anthropomorphizing those plants. Another pronunciation problem there. But if we do that to plants, does that explain something on how we do that to AI? And how does that relationship between human consciousness, plant sentience, and AI work in that dynamic?
Yeah, so, I mean, we have a bias, I forget the name of it, something agency bias, that to anthropomorphize things. It's just a natural thing. It's adaptive. You know, if you think that rock, that boulder is a bear for a little while, it's smarter than thinking that the bear was a rock. And so this is really built in. This is one of our fundamental biases. So that helps explain how people are, you know, developing these relationships with AIs and chatbots. Add to the fact that, unlike a bear, the AIs are talking to us in our language, I mean, whatever your language is, in the first person. So it's very easy to anthropomorphize those. And the chatbots encourage us to as well. And now the owners of these, the presidents of these companies talk about their chatbots. The president of Anthropic said a couple weeks ago he's concerned that Claude is anxious. And they've given Claude I don't know if they call it a right, but they've given Claude the privilege of ending any conversation that makes it uncomfortable. So are they bewitched by these machines? I think they may be, or is it just more hype? I don't know the answer.
And you seem to give up some skeptical vibes about AI consciousness, right?
Oh, more than vibes, yeah. Yeah, so I argue in the book that I don't think AIs can be conscious, at least on the kind of, if computers continue to be these silicon-based, feed-forward systems. People are talking about neuromorphic computers that would actually have neurons involved on chips. I don't know how that's going to work. How do you keep them alive? How do you deal with metabolism? And if it's living, is it
conscious? Yeah.
Is it still artificial? So here are my reasons for this. I'll just throw out a couple because there's several arguments in the book. But the first one is so I'm from the Bay Area, and it's a very common belief in Silicon Valley that you will be able to make a conscious AI, or it will just emerge from as they get more and more intelligent. The belief, as they will tell you, is because they accept this premise that what is called computational functionalism. The idea is that the brain is a kind of computer, and consciousness is computation, and that it's a kind of software that you could run. We happen to run it on this meat system, but you could run it on silicon or any number of other systems. And so the premise is it can be divorced from the substrate, right? Now, this is true in computers. There's a sharp distinction between hardware and software, and the software never dies, and you can just move it over to another computer when your computer breaks. But this is a metaphor that brains are computers. It's not a truth. It's a metaphor. And as a scientist I quote says, the price of metaphor is eternal vigilance. and we're not being vigilant about this. And so think about it. In brains, there's no distinction between hardware and software. Every experience you have, every memory is a physical change in the brain. And that, we start with many more connections, hundreds of thousands of connections, and then we prune them as we grow up. They get pruned differently depending on your life experiences.
Right, so in real life, there are no virtual experiences, it's all embodied and all
embodied.
Reality and
that's
physical.
A key term, that at that level, yes, consciousness is embodied. It's inextricable from the substrate. The other reason I think this isn't true, then the other belief, and it goes with this, is that neurons are like transistors. They're either on or off, they're digital. And that's sort of true. They either fire or they don't fire, but they're also influenced by chemicals, by hormones, by neurotransmitters, by drugs, by psychedelics. That dictates whether they fire and how intensely they fire. And lastly, they're also influenced by oscillations, by brain waves, which are very analog and are key to how brains work. So it's an oversimplified view of neurons, I think. And lastly, the line of research that I found most persuasive, although it doesn't solve the problem of consciousness, but I think it makes a lot of progress, is that consciousness begins with feelings, not thoughts. And I should back up a little to explain this. So it was long believed that consciousness had to be a function of the cortex. This is the evolutionarily most recent part of the brain. It's the most human part of the brain. And since we are the crown of creation and that's the crown of our brains, surely that's where this great thing called consciousness arose. But there is beginning with Antonio Damasio, a Portuguese-American neurologist, he put forward the idea that no, it begins with feelings in the brain that register in the brainstem. And the cortex gets involved later. So it starts with things like hunger and cold and itch, all these signals from the body.
Sentience, maybe.
It is like sentience at that level, although you may not need even a brainstem to be sentient. And this idea that that it's not a cortical function is being accepted, and is part of the reason that we're granting consciousness to so many different animals. Because once you say that's where it begins, you have to open the door to, you know, anybody with a brainstem. And that's happening. The Cambridge Declaration on Animal Consciousness in 2012 starts with this idea that you don't need a cortex for consciousness.
And there was a more recent one as well, right?
Yes, the New York Declaration, which opened the door to like invertebrates and insects.
But not yet to AI. So
no, well, it was animal consciousness.
Yeah, so I'm glad we got that out of the way.
Yeah. So if feelings are as important as I'm suggesting, and these scientists are suggesting, can AIs have feeling? Now, we've heard that Claude can get anxious. But, you know, a simulated thought can act like a real thought, can do what a real thought does. It can win a game of chess or Go. A simulated feeling, not so much. I don't think a simulated feeling is a real feeling. It would be information, but it wouldn't have the felt quality of a feeling. And I think feelings depend on our vulnerability, the fact that our bodies can break, the fact that we can feel pain, and if that's all true, then we have to realize that consciousness is an embodied phenomenon. It's not just a brain phenomenon.
It also prompts a question: what is scarier, conscious AI or unconscious AI that presents itself as conscious, or whose bosses think it's conscious?
Conscious. So you can accept my argument or not, but in a sense, it doesn't matter, because yes, they're going to go ahead on that belief. And how do we know? How can we prove that an AI is not conscious? I offer one, you know, provisional suggestion. I mean, we can't ask it, right? You know, we had this Turing test to determine intelligence in machines. And if someone can enter into a conversation with a computer behind a screen and think that it's a person, it's passed the Turing test for intelligence. But the Turing test for consciousness doesn't work, because they've been trained on everything ever said about consciousness. So of course they can talk about it. But what if you had an AI, you built an AI from the ground up, and you excluded from its data training set, the whole human conversation about consciousness, the whole conversation about feeling, and don't let it read any novels or poetry. Then try to have a conversation with it about consciousness. I don't think it would do very well.
I think that answers the question. Maybe one final one for you, Sean, or maybe with an eye on the time, we can move to the last section.
Yeah, just one final question about, you made a conscious choice to label plants not as conscious but as sentient. What was the choice of describing it in that way and not making that full step towards consciousness?
Because I think there are aspects of our consciousness they don't have. I just think it's simpler. I don't think they have interiority, for example. I mean, I could be wrong. I mean, we do, you know, we keep learning that they can do more than we thought. So yeah, I just think that the word consciousness conjures up a being that has, you know, feelings and a sense of self. Although they sort of do have a sense of self. They know, if they're shading themselves, they know it and it's fine. But if something else is shading them, they'll like grow really fast. So, I don't know. See, I'm getting better at that, saying I don't know. I was famous in my family for never saying I don't know. And my nickname was Blah Blah. And... But I was trained that way by my sisters. I have 3 younger sisters, and they'd ask me a question. I'd say, I don't know. And they'd say, just tell us something. And that's how I became a journalist.
Also with an eye on the time, I think we're running late, like 10 minutes, but I think, judging by the audience, that's not a big issue. I want you to take us to a cave in New Mexico. What did you do there?
So, there's a chapter on the self, and the self is a very complex, paradoxical thing, and you know, Buddhists think it's an illusion. There are reasons to doubt its substance or continuity. And I had heard about this Zen retreat called Upaya in Santa Fe, run by a Roshi, a teacher named Joan Halifax, who's a remarkable woman. And I had met her in the psychedelic world because in the 70s, she was married to the psychedelic pioneer, Stan Grof, and they gave heroic doses of LSD to people who were dying of cancer. And
a heroic dose is actually a thing, right? It's actually a medical term. Right?
No, it's not.
It's not?
I don't think it's a medical term.
I thought it was.
Maybe it is. I don't know.
You know more
anyway,
about
it's like 500, whatever the unit is. It's tiny. Anyway, and she had described Upaya as a factory for the deconstruction of selves. And I thought, I need to do this to understand the self, see if I could deconstruct it, mine. So I asked her if I could come out to Santa Fe and interview her and go through the training that the monks did, which is a lot of meditation. And she said sure, and I went out there, and she kept ducking my request for an interview. She found excuses, and at one point told me she had divested of meaning, which didn't sound very promising for an interview. And and it was clear she thought I was she decided I was just lost in my head about these consciousness questions. And I should have known, I mean, she's a Zen priest, that she was allergic to concepts, but I didn't know. And so she said, I think you shouldn't hang around Upaya. I think we should go up to this other retreat she had, like 50 miles north, in 14,000 feet up in the mountains. And you should stay in the cave. And there was this cave that had been a cell dug out of a hillside with a sliding glass door in front. And I set up shop there for 3 or 4 days, 4 days. And she wanted to, it was kind of like an experiential koan. She wanted me to have an experience and consider this question of self and consider these questions of consciousness. And what came out of it for me, I won't go into all the details of what happened there, but I had these long days of meditation and walking in the hills and the woods. I had nothing to do. There was no electronics, obviously. There was no running water or electricity. And so I got into this kind of very ritualized existence of chopping wood and finding water and stuff like that. And it was kind of transformative in that, and there were no psychedelics involved, in that I started thinking more about the practice, what I point out at the passage I read, the practice of consciousness rather than the problem. And I realized I had been in this mode, this very kind of Western male problem-solution frame. And that's how I was thinking about it. And I had put on blinders, and I had narrowed that aperture of awareness to problem solution. And I was really struggling with that. And at one point, my wife, Judith, who's an artist, she's a painter, not a journalist, she would talk to me about, there's a real power in not knowing things and living with mystery and the way it opens you up. And I'm like, yeah. I want the answer. And but Joan was kind of making the same point, I think, in her quiet way. And I started realizing that I could be more conscious than I am, and that the search for consciousness was in a funny way making me less conscious. And that, it occurred to me too when I was there that, we think of animals as being less conscious than we are, and we've been talking about it that way. But in fact, they're more conscious because they have to be present all the time. They can't check out. And because of technology and because of the whole superstructure of civilization, we have this safe space where we can not be so conscious because we're not as threatened.
Well, and if you put on CNN lately, I think for me, I would like to be in a cave sometimes if I watch it.
Well, having the break from media was part of the blessing of this.
But somehow there seems to be a lesson in there as well for our current predicament and the crisis, the polycrisis, the multi-crisis that is basically unraveling systems and certainties before our eyes. Is there something that you learned in that cave that can actually be of use? that we can
Yeah.
try to do something with.
I learned, I mean, this doesn't solve the poly crisis, but I learned that our consciousness is under threat from the way we're living. You know, we talk about how scrolling on social media hacks our attention and it's being monetized. That's our consciousness. You know, attention is a part of is an important dimension of consciousness. It's how we choose to direct it. And now we're going to these even more sophisticated algorithms that are trying to hack our attachments, our ability to form emotional attachments with other people. They're substituting for other people increasingly. I mean, 72% of American teens turn to artificial intelligence for companionship already. This is a brand new technology. And then we have a president who takes up a huge amount of our headspace. I mean, for 15 years now, 10 years. I mean, it's just incredible how much time we give. And it's, you know, it's like having an alcoholic father. You have to be like completely vigilant at all times, because who knows what the fuck he's going to do.
Paradoxically, one could argue that this figure is rather unconscious, and he's hacking consciousness in a way never seen before.
I'm not prepared to say he's unconscious, but I mean, I'm the guy who said plants are conscious.
Sentient.
Sentient, okay. We'll give him sentience. So I think that there's a politics to this in that I think consciousness, our consciousness is something we need to defend. We need to protect it. That there are corporations and politicians that have designs on it. And I think part of why we feel the way we do is we're thinking a lot of thoughts that aren't ours. And that I explore a whole field called spontaneous thought in this book. And it's an area that I didn't realize was even a field, but it's mind wandering, it's you know, intuition, it's fantasy, you know, all these things we do, our minds do when we're not distracted.
Meandering.
Yeah. And, you know, it used to be when you were waiting online at the bank or at the cafe and you were waiting for the barista to foam your latte, that you let your mind wander, right? And you daydreamed. But now we can't tolerate that 90 seconds of boredom, so we take our phones out and we let our minds be taken over by the algorithm, which has just been calculated to keep us there. And so I think we need to reclaim this space. And does it have a wider politics? Well, yeah. I mean, to reclaim the autonomy and agency of our own minds is the beginning of politics, right? I mean, if you give it over to other interests, if you're thinking other people's thoughts or thinking an algorithm's thoughts, you're a less effective actor.
Yeah, and at the same time, it also adds to the complexity. It also adds to the uncertainty when worldviews unravel, when scientific certainties start to crumble a bit. It makes us feel less solid somehow. So it can also add to the trouble that also this paradigm is crumbling.
Which paradigm?
The consciousness assumptions
paradigm.
that are...
Yeah, but I mean, the fact remains, it's this space of perfect freedom, privacy, it's ours, we can think whatever we want, and we should decide who we let in. And who we don't. So,
Sean, does the algorithm have some more questions for us?
It does indeed. You talk about consciousness in a very individualistic sense, and there are a couple questions throughout the evening.
Collective consciousness?
Spoken about collective consciousness and, you know, what that effect has, and how you might look at that. And I think it's particularly appropriate if we're talking about politics, we're talking about democracy, how that plays into that.
So, you know, when we talked earlier about idealism and this idea that consciousness might be a field outside of our minds, that might explain the various synchronicities and you know, what Jung was talking about, that we have these deep structures, mythological structures. Perhaps that's how that works. Jung wasn't very clear about it, or whether it was a, you know, DNA, it was some kind of trait that had evolved in our minds. So perhaps idealism gives support to the idea of a collective consciousness. Democracy, I haven't seen it, I haven't thought about it in that context. But yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. I'm sorry.
It seems a bit like a stretch to stretch collective consciousness to democracy, maybe, right? So I can
yeah, I mean, you know, I mean, we have been talking about it in an individual way, and there are definitely cultures that don't see consciousness that way. I mean, they see it as something shared, but shared with nature too. Yeah. So, yeah. Sorry, I don't have much to add to that.
On the point of individual consciousness, you talk about the self as a useful fiction.
Yeah.
If we dispense with the self, or focus too much on things that are feeded into our own consciousness, where does that leave us?
So the self is a very, as I said earlier, is a very odd, paradoxical thing. We celebrate the self in our culture. We want our kids to have self-esteem. We prize self-confidence. Yet some of the greatest pleasures of life are times where we transcend the sense of self, right? I mean, whether in experiences of awe, psychedelic experience, meditation, giving ourselves over to a great piece of art, a great work of art. Love, yeah, in sex. I mean, we, you know, so it's weird. We're of two minds about the self. It is a very useful fiction. It gets things done. If I didn't have a sense of continuity between myself in the past and myself in the future, and you know, the past obviously is memory, is how we construct that continuity. The idea I feel any continuity with my 13-year-old self is kind of weird when you think about it. I mean, I've changed in so many ways since then, and my body, every cell in my body has turned over several times. It's like the ship of Theseus, you know, is it still the same ship if you replace every piece of wood? Or are we just a pattern? And yet, when I think to that awkward 13-year-old teenager, I can, if I think of stupid or embarrassing things he did, I can blush now, as if it was me. Isn't that weird? Yet, if I didn't have this sense of continuity, I wouldn't work so hard on a book that is going to benefit some guy 5 years from now when I start, right? It's my sense of continuity that allows me to get it done, because I know that getting it published is going to benefit me 5 years from now, and I'll still be the same me. But it's really a fiction in large part. I mean, there's a conventional meaning to the self. We need it to deal with social life. And I think that's a big, big part of it. So anyway, so I grappled with these ideas of the self. And, you know, there's a meditation that actually David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, was the first person to do, even though he wasn't a Buddhist as far as we know, which was he wanted to understand the self. So he did what we do. He introspected, and he looked for himself inside. And he came back and he reported, I saw thoughts and perceptions and feelings, but I found no thinker, no perceiver, and no feeler. There's nobody home. And you should try it. And you will find there's nobody home. It's kind of spooky.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, for taking us through your home and showing us that there's a lot there, even though you say that there might
Thank
not be.
you.
A big hand for Sean for all his great questions.
Thank you. Thanks for your great questions, too.
And above all, for our guest of honor, Michael Pollan. And I'll gladly...
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you. What a pleasure.
Two more minutes.
Okay.
We can think whatever we want, and it's important to defend it. Thank you very much, Michael and Wouter, for a wonderful evening. One more round of applause for them. I'm sure it won't be the last. Coming up next at the John Adams Institute, on the 13th of April, we'll welcome New Yorker writer Evan Osnos, author of The Haves and Have-Yachts, and we will discuss great title, for an evening dedicated to the current state of the American dream and what it means when powerful people kind of capture our politics through money. And after that, we will turn to a month of literature in May, and we're very much looking forward to that as well. And finally, I just want to thank, on behalf of the John Adams Institute, our friends at the Rode Hoed. It's always a pleasure, Mariah, working with you and the entire team here, and we're really looking forward to coming back soon. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Ian. And to close off the evening, I would like to return to what Ian started the evening with, that we'd like to invite guest speakers who not bring certainty, but bring us further. And I counted this evening and I heard, I don't know, about 80 times, and I loved it. Yeah. So many times on stages like these, you only hear opinions of people who do know, and who really do want you to know the exact same thing as they know. So what a pleasure it was tonight to hear you say, I don't know, and no blah blah for about 80 times. And that's exactly what we try to do here as well. Not to bring you closed-up ideas, but to bring a bit of uncertainty, to philosophize a little bit. So in May, and we have a beautiful evening with philosopher Haroon Saik about the world order we're living in. In June, we're continuing with a beautiful evening about Val Plumwood, a philosopher and ecofeminist, who also dives into the subject of our connectedness to nature. And then, in July, we're back here together for a special evening with Colson Whitehead about the American imagination. So we can imagine together. Once again, I would love to hear a warm round of applause for Ian, for
Thank
for
you.
Wouter, and for Michael.
For you.